This is Tamika Caston-Miller with Think, Flow, Grow Live. And I am here today with my co host in life and of today's podcast, which is Lenie Caston-Miller. Today's episode is focused on is called The Life and Times of Fear. And we're talking about times in which we're really dealing with a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear, of course, delusion, and PTSD really is what's being seeded. And so I wanted to talk to you guys today, and I wanted to have people here who can speak to these things because of living them, and because of also having moved beyond them oftentimes. And then, of course, if you are a mental health professional, then I'm excited to have you here as well. And I know that Sylvia will be on here. My goal is to actually have this podcast last 1 hour. This podcast episode, our live episodes usually go a little longer, but my goal is that it is going to be 60 minutes. So that we all have our ideas. Shars is laughing out loud at me right now. All right. The very first thing I wanted to do was define these things: anxiety, delusion, fear, and PTSD. I wanted to define them according to what is traditional thinking. And then I also wanted to provide some perspective based on history and coming from a yogic philosophy standpoint, or yoga philosophical standpoint. And so, but before I do that, I'd like for us just to consider all of these things as a part of what I would call sometimes false knowledge. And so we'll get into that. And this is a concept in yoga that is called viparyaya, or wrong knowledge, which is the foundation, I think, at a lot of these issues that is based on real things, but that we've taken and we've started creating imaginings that create horrible things. So we'll go into that as well. So the very first thing is something I think that we can all relate to, which is anxiety. I mean, I feel like anxiety is, I'm not going to say an old friend, but like a friend that certainly, or is a neighbor. You know, anxiety is the neighbor that you see every now and then. And sometimes you need to go over there to ask for a cup of sugar, and then you have a conversation and start talking about things. And the friend invites you into their house, and bada bing, bada bum, you're in anxiety's house. At least that's how I see it. Because for me, anxiety isn't somewhere where I live most days. It is a place that is visited for me. And I definitely know that there are people out there living in anxiety's house. So if you are a person who lives with anxiety on a consistent basis, definitely please call in and share your experiences with that. So what is anxiety? Well, it is, according to the powers that be out there, it is actually your body's natural response to stress. It is a feeling of fear or apprehension about what's to come. This is according to Psychology Today. This is what it is. It's a body's natural response to stress. So I think sometimes we start to feel really bad about ourselves because we have anxiety or we experience anxiety. But the truth is that it's very natural to have anxiety because we're stressed all the time. And that stress can be small or huge. And of course, if we are in a really large stress response, then anxiety is going to be bigger. but it is this fear about what is to come. It's not about what is happening right now. And I think that that's something that is really important to acknowledge, is that anxiety is not a present, it's felt presently, but it is about a future thinking. So in that, then the responses to that are definitely creations, then they're manifestations of our imagination, because we haven't actually experienced whatever we're fearing, which is then causing the anxiety. Do you have any thoughts on that, Lenny?
I don't know. I just think anxiety is natural.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's definitely natural.
I never really thought about it as present, past, or future tense, though.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting for me to realize that anxiety has nothing to do with something that it could have, but it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with something that I've experienced. And so in that regard, it's a little disconcerting that that can be something that I've completely made up. And this leads me to talking about actually what in yoga we call the states of the mind, or the mind stuff. And essentially in yoga, we understand that there are 5 states of the mind, or there are states of the mind, and they either cause misery or non-misery. And so when we're in that non-misery state, that yogic state, that being okay with things state, but oftentimes we're not. And so when we are dealing with anxiety, which is of course a misery state, right? We're actually deep in what's called vikalpa, or imagination. We're creating something that hasn't yet happened, creating a scenario. And this is what's called vikalpa, which is creating a situation, essentially. And we can also think, what's crazy about imagination to me is that we use imagination all the time to create beautiful things. So we're, as Kim Pence said on the episode that we had with her, we're great manifestors. So we can either manifest something from our imagination that is positive and beautiful. An example of this is when we're kids and we are creating stories and art and all of these things that are of beauty. But then as we start having experiences in life and fear starts being seeded, which of course also can happen when you're a child. I mean, I'm not a crazy person. Then all of a sudden those figments of our imagination can start to be things that are really destructive and create misery. So, and of course, again, anyone who has had any type of experience with anxiety, please do call in and let me know what you are thinking. When it comes to delusion, the Oxford Dictionary defines delusion as an idiosyncratic belief or impression that is firmly maintained despite being contradicted by what is generally accepted as reality or a rational argument. And it's typically a symptom of mental disorder. I'm like, ouch. Okay. Okay, Oxford, that was a little harsh. But I mean, we have examples within the leadership of our country that shows us that that's exactly what happens when it comes to seeing actual delusional beliefs and behaviors. I think the crazy thing is that when we're looking at delusion, according to the dictionary, we're seeing that these are these are thoughts that are contradicted and generally accepted as reality, or contradicted as what is generally accepted as reality. And I think that what's really important about that is that what's generally accepted as reality could also not be true. So we could generally accept as reality that all women work in the house and dim the lights when their husbands come home, and greet them with a kiss and put the babies to bed and all those things. And that, of course, can not be someone's reality when they're an LGBT person or a single person or don't want to have kids or whatever. And so I think it's a little dangerous to speak to what's generally accepted as reality, because that's not necessarily defined general. But and I think within the LGBT community, we've had a lot of trauma because people have said, well, what you are doing, who you are as a person, the life that you're living is not real, it's not right, and that is not what is generally accepted as a code of behavior in our family or our culture. That's what other people do, or that's what the French people do, or whatever. and that becomes a point then of trauma, because someone is saying, well, you're living a delusion if you think that you can live the life this life, because this is not how people live life. And this is I guess the beginning of gaslighting. So I just want to just put that out there, because we'll talk more about gaslighting. But I think that there is a potential of gaslighting within this construct of delusion. And of course, we all know that LGBTQ people were treated for having a mental disorder for decades. This only stopped just recently. And of course, there are still people who are treating LGBT people as having a mental disorder because they have their delusional ways of thinking about love and how they feel about themselves. And of course, when we talk about the trans community, this is super huge, because they're like, oh, well, you're just, you can't just go do whatever you're living a fantasy. So this word delusion can be really problematic, I think, because while there are some people who are definitely delusional in the way that they're doing the things or the way that they're living their lives, there are also people who use that word as ammo, against people who don't think like them and who don't buy into the agreements of what's considered the status quo of a society. And I know for both of us, I mean, we've both had our members of our family, try to gaslight us in the way that we.
Can we get a definition for gaslighting?
Oh, yes, gaslighting. Gaslighting is one of my. Oh, yeah, Katie is chiming in now. Katie is very, very familiar with gaslighting. Am I right, Katie? Feel free to call in if you'd like. We were actually just talking about this yesterday, but we didn't use the terms. But gaslighting is essentially when someone makes you feel like you're crazy for the way that you live or the way that you think, or they try to make you feel crazy for the way that you think or the way that you're living. And they do it either with words, by telling you that you're a delusional person, you're this, that, or the other, or you're outside of the culture of the family, or you're outside of the norm. You're not normal.
I don't get why it's called gaslighting, though.
Why is it called gaslighting? I don't know. Why don't you look? Does anyone know? Sylvia, do you know why it is called gaslighting? Shars knows. Shars, are you going to call, or are you going to type it out? Call. There was a movie called Gaslighting, Sylvia is telling us. But I don't know.
Oh, wait. The Google says the term originated from the 1938 play and 1944 film adaptation, Gaslight, where the protagonist's husband slowly manipulated her into believing she's going mad. The name comes from a part in the film where the husband is using the gas lights in an upstairs flat, causing them to dim on his own.
Wow. So that whole new movie that's coming out right now about the dude who's like supposedly haunting his wife from the grave or whatever is all about
Mm.
gaslighting. So, um, oh, Shars has just typed out there's a 1938 play, and she just typed out what it is for our visual audience. Um, yeah, is a person who is making you question everything that you think is real. Um, I it, I just think it is. First of all, how crazy does the person have to be, or how convinced does the person have to be of their own truth to like gaslight another person? And are they aware they're gaslighting? I mean, obviously in that movie he was, but are people generally aware when they are gaslighting?
I think it's a case by case basis, and some people are psychopaths and some people aren't.
I think there are more psychopaths than we think out there. um, um, yeah, and the shitty part is when they're in our own families. There are a lot of people who have gaslit me in my old friendship circle just because I had a girlfriend and then I had a boyfriend, and I remember the the there was a group of lesbians that I used to hang out with. It was a meetup, and I remember I had a girlfriend at the time when I broke up with a girlfriend, and then I had a boyfriend because I love all people, regardless of their genitalia. I I had the people in that group were like, what the fuck? Like, what are you doing? Like I was somehow, diminishing the group, or I was somehow diminishing the culture by having a boyfriend. This has happened to me as a Black woman. Like, well, you have a white partner, so hashtag no Black love for you. Um, I I know that I've had conversations with Shars, in which my friend Shars, in which we've talked about how just culturally, as people of color, there are sometimes ways in which we're supposed to act according to our culture, and if we don't act that way, then we're wrong or somehow out operating outside of the culture.
I think that's any culture. I don't think it's just a culture of color, because even
I
white
agree.
people have a quote unquote civility that they're supposed to follow per their culture, and you get, I guess, gaslit or whatever when you break that mold.
Yeah, I think especially for white women. We talked about this last week as well, where white women are supposed to act a certain way, are supposed to do a certain thing, are supposed to be genteel, are supposed to be the homemaker. And what happens if you're none of those things? What happens if you're a terrible homemaker? Does that make you less of a woman?
That makes you a badass bitch because you're better at something else than pushing out babies and doing your man's laundry and dishes.
Katie said it makes you a wild woman. Yeah, I mean, there's a whole book written about that, right? That Women Who Run with Wolves, by Dr. Estes, that talks about how there's a whole culture of people who do not follow the culture of their family. And of course, families have their own culture, and if you don't fall within the norms of your family culture, then you're also, the black sheep. Being called the black sheep is just a way of a family, an entire family gaslighting you.
Hmm.
And then the crazy thing is, what I find is crazy is that oftentimes those people are not operating within those norms because they're choosing it. They're operating within those norms because they want to maintain a system that oppresses them. It's almost like a Stockholm syndrome. Alex is calling herself the black sheep. Or are you the black sheep, or are you just the only individuated person in your family? I mean, I think that this is where it really gets interesting. I also find it interesting that there's nothing but women on this episode right now, and that I'm just calling out men, for not doing the work of being involved in the conversation and doing the work of working to evolve. Where the fuck are the men? Oh, okay, Jeff, I see you. All right. Okay, Jeff is here. All right, good. Jeff, you better comment.
There's also a 60 GHC.
We don't know.
We don't know.
We don't know.
We don't know that could be anyone.
Jeff has single-handedly saved his entire gender by being
Jeff's
here.
pretty awesome.
But Jeff is pretty awesome. We know Jeff personally, so and he's done a lot of work. But where are all the other men? There are like 10 or 15 women on here, and there's one man. Come on, men, do better. Jeff, share the episode and get other men involved in this conversation. All right, so we've so far talked about anxiety just a little bit. Oh, and Dimitri's listening too. So yeah, so now we have 2 whole men on this.
Jeff and his boo, that's what's up.
All right, I love it. We also have people within the LGBT community who are listening. And I think that gaslighting is something we deal with on a daily basis. And it's not even necessarily because people are trying. When we look at heteronormative behaviors and heteronormative TV shows and listen to heteronormative conversations, we never see ourselves. That's, how are we supposed to feel about our lives? Or like when the Cheerios...
The media in Hollywood has started to get better about that. But I mean, yeah, it's still definitely a white man, woman centric society with the 2.5 kids and chasing the Joneses.
Yeah, and FYI, having 2 kids is a lot. I'm just saying, don't do it. Stick with 1. Just kidding. But but yeah, yes. I mean, but I remember when the Cheerios commercial did. Cheerios had a commercial where it was like 2 dads or something, and everyone around, probably a million moms, those bitches, came out and they were like, "This isn't normal. You guys are doing this abnormal, unchristian like whatever, because apparently you have to be a Christian to eat Cheerios, and apparently you can't be an LGBTQ person and a Christian," and just all the things that they were doing. So yeah, I think that there are some shifts now, but there are also always those groups like A Million Moms that just make an entire, movement out of gaslighting the LGBTQ community.
Yeah.
And it's only the LGBTQ community. It's nothing else.
There's always going to be people who are in places of privilege that are bored and twiddling their thumbs at home. And then they're like, oh, this is something I can protest.
Yeah. This is an important point because we're going to come back to gaslighting later. But I do want to get into also fear now. And according to Psychology Today, now mind you, I am not a psychologist. I've never claimed to be one. I know, however, we have one in our audience. So if I say something off, please contradict me and feel free to call in. But according to what I have found regarding psychology about fear is that, and what I found to be fascinating is it is part instinct. But it is also part learned and, of course, is part taught. So we are in this habit of teaching and reteaching and learning and relearning fear, which then informs the instincts that we already have that are there. And of course, this stress response is what is a result of it. So I just want to tell you guys what Dr. Theo Saudi says about fear, which is that it is essentially it elicits the fear response of freeze, fight, flight, or fright. Freeze means you stop what you're doing and focus on the fearful stimulus to decide what to do next. Next, you either choose fight or flight. You decide whether to deal with the threat directly or work around it. So the examples here are: you read a memo, your company's laying off people, and that is freeze. And then you tell your boss why you shouldn't be laid off. That's fight. Or you start looking for another job. That is flight. And when the fear is overwhelming, you can experience fright. And then fright, you neither fight nor flee, you just do nothing except obsess about the issue. Like you obsess about the situation, you ruminate, you complain, but you actually take no action. And being continuously in fright mode can lead to hopelessness and depression. This is such a hugely important point right now. Because whereas many of us have experienced the fear of getting coronavirus or the fear of not knowing what will happen when we go outside and when we interact with other people, we are actually being imposed almost into this fright mode because of media and also because of the fact that we can't go out there and go do the things that we would normally do. Well, I'll put normally in air quotes. And so, yeah, hella people are stuck in fright mode right now. And Alex says in the comments that she's always in fright mode. And I was just talking about this yesterday with a friend who will remain unnamed about being stuck in the churning wheels of fright actually never leads to action. You still have to at some point step out and do something in order to actually stop those consistent wheels turning. And of course it's going to lead to a sense of hopelessness. Of course it's going to lead to a sense of depression. If you're like obsessing the entire time about the problem and but doing nothing about it, of course you're going to feel hopeless. I think that the people who I know who have gotten out of really fearful circumstances have done a lot of work. And actually that is why Lenie is here.
I'm Jon Snow. I know nothing.
You are not Jon Snow. And we learned that Jon Snow actually did know something at the end of Game of Thrones, but I digress. So this leads us directly into PTSD, which is, which according to the American Psychiatric Association is a psychiatric disorder that can occur in people who have experienced or witnessed a traumatic event such as a natural disaster, a serious accident, a terrorist act, war or combat, rape, or other violent personal assault. And so Lenie is a war veteran. She was in the Iraq War during the fun period. and was exposed to all those things, actually. I don't want to speak for PTSD because I think that PTSD is something that needs to be spoken from. Well, what are your thoughts on PTSD? How about that? I'll just say that.
I mean, I don't necessarily agree with the definition that you just read, because I think based off of my experiences and everything I learned through overcoming and working through my shit, PTSD anyone can have PTSD whether or not they witness a terrorist act or like do all those things. Because like from all the information that I gathered during my recovery from it, if we want to call it recovery, or my processing of it, that's a better term, is if your body is in a constant stress reaction, you're traumatizing your body every day. So like for me, just being, even if I hadn't gotten shot at, I hadn't gotten things blowing up near me, like hadn't actually had those real like traumatic events, just being in the war zone where the idea that someone could kill me at any given time for 365 days straight is enough for your mind to get stuck in the fight or flight loop that is what causes the PTSD. because PTSD is when, from my own experience, when you have a collection of incidences or stress responses that throw you into fight or flight mode every time it gets triggered. So for me, one of my things was loud noises, sudden noises would trigger my PTSD. Well, obviously, because mortars blew up 5 meters from me, and the only thing that saved my ass was a concrete wall, that's a legitimate response that I would, duck and have a physical reaction to hearing a sudden loud noise, right? But the same thing could be said of just being always stressed with the thought of something coming in can still trigger that same responses. So like there's people who came back from war that never got shot at, never had anything traumatic, quote unquote traumatic, happen to them, but they still have PTSD because of that stress response and being in that stress response for so long, because your cortisol levels are elevated so high in those situations. It's actually, with this whole corona and the media frenzy and all that's going on right now, like the whole world is getting traumatized with PTSD right now, if they believe it or not, because everyone is in this stress response. Everyone is fearing for grandma down the street or themselves or their kid, or there's job instability, and there's, all this stuff that everyone knows is going on. And that's enough for your, there's this part in the brain that activates fight or flight. It goes into your prenormal senses. I forget what it's called. Yeah. But it's this little spot in your brain, and that's enough to overactivate that, which is what causes the PTSD. So it's like clusters of memories that get stored into your body, into your cellular level, that causes the PTSD.
Yeah, and I think, and yes, Katie, I believe it is the amygdala, and this is it's either the amygdala or the hypothalamus, but I'm pretty sure it's the amygdala.
It's been a while since I did my training,
and I should know this as a person who has who's teaches anatomy, but I can't think of it right now because I'm too busy in the psychology of it. But. Yes, I should. But yeah, I can't think of it. But yeah, I think all of us we're living this global traumatic moment in our lives. And I think if we acknowledge that, then we're already steps ahead of others who are not acknowledging that. But if we acknowledge it, then we can begin to dissect, or acknowledge our own behaviors or be able to say to ourselves, this is a temporary experience, and it is a traumatic experience, and it is a temporary experience. Like, it is important, I think, to be able to know that this is a unique situation. This is not the way that the world is. But how many times have we heard, a person saying, what happens at the end of this? And it's that anxiety of fearing what happens next, that is the mortar.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also think like what happens at the end of this is really dependent on the individual themselves, because they can either process through what is happening, or what at the end of this, what happened to them or during this, or they could let it fester and never process it and always have issues from it. Like, yeah. If you look at where I am today compared to where I was just 8 years ago, screw that, just 2 years ago on my recovery through my PTSD, it's night and day. And the difference is the fact that I was proactive and I did the work to do the mental and cellular level work people don't really talk about or know much about. Like, well, they're starting to get there, but it's hard work, and it's work that most people aren't willing to take on. Like, doing the work to undo war for me was actually harder than going through war.
Yeah, I
Because
imagine so.
you actually literally have to like take a journey within yourself and like fight the shit you were running from and come to terms with it. And if you had to make choices that were shittier, which is a lot of times what you're choosing like the shitty choice or the shittier choice. And that goes for the same thing as a single mom or, you know, choosing to visit your parents or not visit your parents right now, you know, things like that. And so being able to process and work through that is the only way that you release it.
Can you tell us more? Having a question from Katie asking about your healing journey and what that was or what that looked like.
Well, it was a very long journey. So I was in war for 365 days, and then I was in the healing journey from 2007 until last year. And there's still like things are still coming up too. Like even though you've like addressed a certain issue or an aspect of your trauma, it'll come up later in ways that you're like, oh, I thought I handled you, I guess not. And so like it's like an ongoing thing. But to speak more to like what I did and like my journey, it started with going to the VA and taking a questionnaire, and they're like, oh, you need to go see mental health. So then when I was in the mental health programs with the VA, they sent me, obviously this was all optional. Like I say they sent me, but like they offered to help me. And I took a informational class just to learn what PTSD was and like how it affects you. And then I joined in a group session, and then that was like all era style. So like there was like Vietnam War vets, Iraqi War vets, Desert Storm, like all war ages. And then I went to a small group setting where it was just Iraq War vets. I was doing a lot of individual one-on-one work with therapists. They put me on medications for depression and anxiety and sleeping and things like that. Then I went to a couple of women's retreats for Iraqi, Afghanistan veterans only. Those I saw a lot of growth in. They were week-long intensive retreats, but both times when I came back from them, I had like major growth. And then I started doing most recently energy work with my energy healer Kim Pence. Shout out Kim Pence Light. And that's when I actually dove into more journey work and really like finding pieces of my soul, I guess would be a good way of putting it, that had been lost along the way, or just kind of like put in quote unquote safe places that I couldn't find anymore.
I think one thing that and there are a plethora of thank yous for, you know, sharing, well, not a plethora, a few thank yous for sharing your journey and sharing this. Two things come up for me, which is how important your story is for all of us, because whether or not we want to see it right now, we will all need to be doing this work when this is over. And so knowing that it is possible to heal from something as difficult as 365 days of war, then I think it relates to our own potential for healing. The other thing is that actually there are two more things. The second thing is that one thing that you have said before, and even on this podcast before, is how your journey to healing encompassed not only healing from war, but also that reality that there were things before war that were happening that required healing as well. And I think that we do not realize that we had, before COVID, we had a whole life of shit that required and needed healing, and that we either were or were not working on. And now we're in this global trauma, and this just added that on top of that. So it's like the PTSD that is acquired from war, when you already have whatever else you have going on before you went to war.
Yeah, and a lot of those things you don't even know or realize you have, because at the surface level, it's not a big thing. It's like maybe my mom said this, or my mom did this, but on a cellular level, it cut you hard. But because of the situation, not having the vocabulary or the definition, you didn't realize that it's something that needs to be worked on.
Yeah, I think that people don't realize that those are little traumas. And actually, Dr. Clarissa Estes speaks about that, how when you are the wild woman, or when you are the black sheep, or whatever, when you have been in a gaslighting situation, either because of your friendship circle, or you were bullied when you were a kid, or you were bullied by your own family. I know Brene Brown talks about how she was always how she felt like she was an outsider in her own family. And while I don't, have the same, hard on for Brene Brown that a lot of other people do, I do think that she speaks to a lot of what is a collection of little traumas that happen, in your life, that are significant to your psyche that you don't even realize are happening. And then we come into a big trauma, the big situation, a day full of mortaring, which for us is this situation right now. And when we come into that, then we are made to sit with ourselves in that moment, and everything that moment is telling us about ourselves, all the fear that we have to deal with, and all of those things. And everything else that we had before that moment is compounding that situation as well. And I think that this is where we if we do not understand PTSD, and we don't understand we don't understand the importance of healing from it, and we don't understand the fact that we will all experience this. The whole world, outside of some, maybe New Zealand or Papua New Guinea, or places that didn't really, go through it because of isolation or great leadership. We're all going to be dealing with this collectively as a world, which means that the world will be informed by millions of people, billions of people who have PTSD. That, and for me, is a really but it doesn't cause me anxiety. What it does evokes in me is a responsibility for my own healing and for my own awareness, so that I'm not one of those people who is then leading from the perspective of being traumatized. I think that that's the real difference of a possible what's on the other side of this, or possibility of what's on the other side of this, is you're either going to be living from a perspective of deep awareness, or being guided by this PTSD or this anxiety that just continues. One interesting thing that you mentioned was this beautiful definition of what anxiety is, which is sitting there and being in a war zone, and being there, and then it's the times between the crazy times, the times between the mortars or the explosives or whatever, that those times between them are little pockets of anxiety, because the next thing is coming. It's just a matter of when. And so it becomes this interesting anxiety building petri dish, if you will. So yeah. And so I think that it's important for us to know that we are all experiencing this global trauma for the reasons that I've just mentioned. And then I also think that it's really important for us to acknowledge that we're all experiencing collective grief. I think if we acknowledge that those two things are happening, we can actually step into healing. So we're going to speak to collective grief, and then also I'm going to let you guys know some tools at the end of this that you, hopefully will be helpful for you. But the first is when we're looking at grief. According to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Kessler, there are the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And they say that this is a part of the framework that makes up our learning to live with loss. I think it was really interesting that there's this word framework. It's a framework that we are using, and like most other frameworks, we need them, right? And so the first one is denial. And of course, Lenny and I have had these conversations about our own things that have been grief inspiring, or even in this time, like, well, I'm fine, I'm doing fine, or whatever, like I'm fine, or whatever. And we'll all just evolve beyond this, or whatever. And there are other ways of denying that this is a shitty time, like, oh, it's going to be fine, we're just going to be great, So what I wanted to speak to with respect to denial is this thing that we see a lot of, especially in, quote, conscious communities, which is spiritual bypassing. And this is the opposite of what you just said that you did, which was a lot of work to acknowledge what was going on, to do the work of learning about what happened, unpack all the things that were made up what your healing looked like. Spiritual bypassing, according to my good friends over at Psychology Today, is defined as spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep personal or emotional unfinished business, and to shore up a shaky sense of self, or to belittle basic needs, feelings, and developmental tasks. And people use spiritual bypassing and call it enlightenment. It's like, I'm above this feeling because, or I'm just going to meditate through this, or I'm just going to yoga through this, or I'm just going to, I'm going to go into this state to just be beyond this moment.
Sounds like numbing.
It's exactly, that is a really nice segue, my darling. It is numbing. For me, it's very akin to numbing. It is, I can't remember who said, Sylvia said, I'm blessed and highly favored. Yes, or God will get us through it. For me, this is when people use yoga, meditation, prayer, dogma to just not feel what's happening and to try to elevate beyond the experience to live it. And it's bypassing, like it's the attempt at bypassing. I don't think it works. But there is another quote that I pulled, and now I can't remember who said it, but it was the foundation of spiritual bypassing is basically avoidance and repression. Mm-hmm. And in some individuals, spirituality serves as a way to rise above or handle the shaky ground beneath. And I think that it was you, Lenny, who said that, like, people use spirituality. I know it's more than you, but you said it on this show, that people use spirituality as a way to, it's their new addiction. Mm. And it's like, if it's like, well, I'm just going to elevate past this. Like, I'm above this moment. I'm above this experience. It is super akin to numbing out. Like, what is it that you are doing when you're taking drugs, including alcohol and prescription drugs? Is it not numbing out? Is it not trying to bypass that moment of shit that we all have to go through? Isn't that it? Or indulging in comfort foods to give us that, doing that emotional eating. Just like, all I need right now is cake or chocolate. I mean, and I'm saying that because I have done these things, not the drug parts of it, but for sure.
Sugar is a very strong
sugar
drug.
is my DOC, as we know.
And I was mainlining it all last week.
We were both freebasing sugar for the first 2 or 3 weeks of coronavirus. I mean, and let's just be honest, happy hour is just a whole bunch of people freebasing sugar together.
Yeah.
I mean,
and getting a buzz about it.
Yeah, it's like it's liquid form. You get to just like, I mean, you're not snorting it, but you're drinking it. I mean, like, it's just like, it is. And so it's a way of just not having to deal with it for a little while. And I mean, we're going to have to deal with it. We cannot bypass this shit. Mm-hmm. The obstacle's the path, according to that old Zen proverb. We have to get on the path. We got to walk the path. We have to be in the thick of it. We have to be in the shit of it, or we're not going to heal from it. FYI, shout out to Shars, who's probably trying to see if we're going to end this episode at 4 p.m. And I can tell you unequivocally, no, we will not. But we might by 4:15. I feel very confident that we will. That we'll be there. So I think that this is super important to acknowledge that coping mechanism of spiritual bypassing or numbing through whatever it is that you use to numb. But there's also this thing that is so annoying, and it is toxic positivity, which is another thing that is just like hugely annoying, which according to, oh man, I don't remember where my source was, but it is a culture of portraying yourself as being happy no matter what. Like that whole positive vibes only, and it's like, it's impossible because real shit happens. Like real problems happen. There's a difference between positive vibes only and being an optimist, which is being able to call a shitty situation what it is and knowing that there's something on the other side of it. But if you're just like being like positive vibes only, that's just not helpful to anyone, I don't think. So all of it is this spiritual bypassing or this numbing. It's like using spirituality to numb, or using drugs and alcohol and food to numb, or using toxic positivity to numb. But that's all it is. And it's the denial, because we are all in collective grief right now. So it's that first stage of grief.
And we all know there's 5.
And we all know there's 5. So, oh shit, there's more. Like we still have 4 other ways before we get through it. So the other is, so then I've brought 2 in together, which is anger and bargaining, which for me looks like scapegoating. So when you're scapegoating, you've got that fear of whatever. And so then you're like, oh, I'm so scared of this, blah, blah, blah. And then you're like, you know what? This is because of blah, blah, blah. And so we scapegoat using a particular community. And this has led to really horrible situations in history, and can have really giant implications personally. So I am
Are you talking about the Crusades right now?
Well,
please tell me you're talking about the Crusades.
I mean, we are going to go into history because I'm a nerd, but according to the Anti-Defamation League, or the ADL, they're essentially are describing this scapegoating as blaming an individual or a group for something based on that person or group's identity, when the person or group is not responsible. And this bias or prejudicial thinking and of course discriminatory acts leads to scapegoating, which then leads to xenophobia. And in history, we have seen this as, being afraid of all the germs from immigrants in the 20s. And then, of course, being afraid of all of the violence and drugs in just last year with immigrants. Immigrants get a lot of scapegoating, FYI.
That's because they're not the majority.
Yeah, exactly.
It's easy to scapegoat the minority.
Yes, spoiler alert, immigrants are always the group that gets scapegoated. But I find it really interesting that it was like Italian and Irish immigrants in New York City in the 20s, and just this most recent year, it's been like everyone south of the border, and what they're going to bring. And in the early 90s, late 80s, with the HIV and AIDS epidemic, of course, we had gay men were the scapegoats. But interestingly, it shifted to Haitians. Like, really? Just Haitians? For some reason, the reason why HIV and AIDS becomes the scapegoats for this situation. But of course, my favorite in history is actually not the Crusades. My favorite in history is during the Black Plague. And this is when Jews.
That lead to the Crusades?
No, it didn't lead to the Crusades. That was had different things going on, but it did lead to the Spanish Inquisition. And when the Black Plague was happening, which we all know was transmitted through rats, and it started through the mosquito and all these things, people were like, "Oh, well, Jews brought the Black Plague onto our community," and it all it did was it created pogroms and genocide against Jewish people. And the crappy thing, besides the fact that many people died, the crappy thing about it is that Jewish folks, after having so many, struggles before that period, before that time frame, had just enjoyed a golden age in the Iberian Peninsula. We're like living life. We're producing all of this art and writing and all this stuff. And then the Black Plague happens, and people are like, "It's you! You're the reason for this." So it's happened. And today, who's the scapegoat? Anthony Fauci and Bill Gates. They're the scapegoat. They've become this huge, these targets for COVID-19 as the people who are somehow responsible for the spread of this disease. And because of
Chinese people.
Well, yeah. Well, we've got the conspiracy theorists who are like, it's Anthony Fauci and Bill Gates. And then we have everybody else who's a racist, who's blaming Chinese people and Asians in general. Like, how are we going to blame an entire continent of people?
I mean, it's not the first time in history.
It's not the first time in history.
I mean, really, it's our go-to.
But my God, how are we going to just say Asians? Like,
how did we say just Muslims?
Well, exactly.
How did we say just the Jews? Because it's easy. Because it's not you.
It's easy. It's easy, and it's lazy. It's emotional and spiritual laziness. And
I work harder than you need to, baby.
Yeah, it's crazy because this xenophobia has been nuts. I want to just mention really quickly, Al Jazeera Network reported in an article on April 6th. This is almost a month before now, so God help us where we are right now, that there have been numerous reports of anti-Asian racism. Anti-Asian, not even Chinese. Like, everyone gets thrown into the same pot together. So anti-Asian racism on the streets of Australia, India, and the United Kingdom. And in the United States, the reporting forum Stop AAPI Hate has recorded more than 1,100 instances of anti-Asian harassment since being set up just in late March. So this was written weeks after that receptacle of information that site for information was set up. and we're already at 1,100 instances, and that was 24 days ago. So imagine where we are right now. And then, and it all just starts up with some, someone looking for someone to hate because of anger, and then bargaining. Because the thing is, so if we get rid of all the Chinese people, then we're finished with this. That's literally not how it works. That's not how it works. It's impossible. But that combination of anger and bargaining is scary. That combination is Jim Crow. That combination is, burning people at the stake. That's the whole witchcraft situation. That combination is the Crusades. The combination is, massive rapes in South Africa of lesbian women, and having, to try to fix them. That combination is scary as hell, especially when people who have traditionally held power are the ones wielding it. And of course, that combination is the Holocaust. So people, are currently targeting Anthony Fauci and Bill Gates. But I think, which is hilarious, because there are a lot of people who are, quote, woke, who are targeting Anthony Fauci and Bill Gates, which was actually, this whole conspiracy was developed by a super, a far right wing Trump supporter.
How am I not surprised?
Who gave a whole exegesis on this. It was a 2,000 word post, which is of course an essay at that point. And out of it, PolitiFact found only 4 factual statements. And they were like, yes, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is a donor to the World Health Organization. Like, they were only like facts that were, non-harmful facts. So I just think that it is interesting that in this experience of grief, of losing what we feel is normal in our lifestyles and all of those things, that we start going through these stages of grief, and one of them, or 2 of them, end up bringing us to scapegoating, which we're seeing across communities, amongst racists, amongst theoretical, woke people, and all of those things. And we're not even talking about all the people who are posting all of the news that is reported on YouTube. FYI, YouTube is not a news source. Of, doctors saying this is why it's happening, this is blah, 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 blah. It's still just bargaining to try to get people to, maybe if I get enough information, then this will stop. And it's like, no, we're literally just going to have to walk the difficult path of this. That's it. And then finally we get to, the paths of it as depression. The last 2 paths of depression and acceptance. And I won't even spend a lot of time on depression, because depression is normal. There's no sidestepping depression. Like, if you're in that point of stress response and you're in fright mode and freeze mode, depression's going to happen.
Yeah, depression's normal until it becomes your state of living, and then it becomes like a medical issue, and then you need to get some help, professional help for that, and possible medication to realign the hormones in your brain. But yeah, and I think that depression is one of those things, at least for me, when I've been in depressive states before, like the death of my mom, of course, whenever there are anniversaries of her death or her birthday coming up, or when I have had really shitty circumstances in my life and they've caused, depressive states, there were always those moments where I was like, I'm going to a place where I might not be able to crawl out of this. And it was that acknowledgement, that notice. But depending on where you are in your life, or where you are in your wokeness of yourself, you might not notice that. I know when I first was in my deepest depressions, I didn't notice it for a long time. So, and
this is where it's really important to have people in your life who are going to be able to point that out. And these aren't the people who will gaslight you. They're the people who are going to be able to say, hey, I've noticed you've been here for a while. Have you gotten some help? And it's also where we can start, where we need to really pay attention to all of the things that we are, the hygiene of what we're taking in mentally. And I will,
And physically.
physically, yeah, all of it. And of course, um, I think that acceptance of our state of grief right now is so empowering. It's so empowering, and it can cause anxiety, because once we've accepted the situation at hand, then there can be, the anxiety of not really knowing what to do with that information. But, we do know that, as I mentioned earlier, anxiety is the body's natural response to stress. And there is a fear about what is to come. Once we've accepted where we are, there can be that twinge of anxiety that comes back, that is a what now. So what I wanted to do to in this third part of our and final part of the podcast, was just give some tools that we can use. And of course, Lenie, if you have any other tools that you have used or things that you want to say, jump right in. But the question is, what can we do now? Remember that at the beginning of this, or in the middle somewhere in this, I stated we're essentially experiencing two things. We're in a global trauma that will seed PTSD. And we're also in collective grief. And that collective grief over what is our world, the loss of what we felt was the norm of what our world is. So what can we do now?
Turn off media.
Yes, mental hygiene. I think we strive toward arriving at correct knowledge or truth is the first thing. Truth of, what am I watching? So Yoga Sutra, or Yoga Philosophy 1.7 talks about how we arrive at facts or correct knowledge. And it is created through what we directly observe, what we interpret, and what we read. And so that means that all three of those things are creating facts for us at any given time. Hopefully those facts are true. So in order to get out of this with some health, is to use all three of those things and to bring them into balance. What am I reading? What am I watching? And what am I listening to? Including the people around me and myself. So but the people around me are really important. And if the people around us are saying, hey, I feel like, you may be going to a place, if we have chosen those people correctly, they're not gaslighting us. They're our mirrors. They're the people who can shine truth back to us.
And sometimes you don't like what you see in that mirror, just saying.
Yeah, sometimes that mirror is hard to see. I don't want to see it. But we need to acknowledge that sometimes we're just reading things that are not helpful. We're watching things that are not helpful, like watching hours and hours of YouTube of people who are actively spiritual bypassing, or who are actively denying through the use of social media to project toxic positivity. That is something we can control, and that is something that is what we can use to move beyond, or to actually acquire truth. Another is gaslighting. Are we gaslighting ourselves? We've don't be your own bully. We've already talked about gaslighting and other people gaslighting us, but realistically, if you feel like shit, you got to honor your own feelings about that, and not be gaslighting your own self. If this is something that you feel and you can directly observe yourself feeling it, that's truth. Now, what's informing how you feel might be untruths or disinformation or whatever, but how you feel is true. And so it's important to not be your own bully and to honor your feelings. So honor how you feel, and then practice discernment with respect to what you're reading, listening to, and seeing. Because the truth is that what you feel is true, but what is creating that feeling might be a load of bullshit. Get present. So bring yourself back
I
to the
love
present
presents.
moment. I love presents too, but we're not talking about those.
Dang
We're
it.
talking about presents with the C.
Dang it.
So with coming back to the present moment is actually, there's a really simple tool that you can use and you don't even have to write it down. All you have to do to come back to the present moment is point out three objects. So you just sit, you open your eyes, and you look at three objects and name them. Right now, I see a plant, a green plant. I see apples. I see my wife. Those are three objects. I've come back to the present moment. It's very simple. And it's a very easy way to bring you back into the present moment. And then you can follow up with that question of, what am I feeling right now?
I am not an object.
You are an object of my desire. Anywho, so this is, how can you come back into the present moment? Another way you can come back into the present moment is also through pranayama or breath work. So you can close your eyes and just focus on your breath. You can do what's called same breath breathing or samavriti pranayama, which is just breathing for, count your breaths and breathe for the same, inhale for the same number as your exhalation. You can do dirga pranayama, which is 3-part breath, which is filling up your breath from your belly at first, and then your ribs, and then your collarbones. I have a tutorial on this on my YouTube page, so find that YouTube page. Or you can just follow your breath for a while. Do it for 5 minutes. It's a great way to come back to presence. And Eckhart Tolle has this great way of coming into presence by just lying down or sitting and just focus on feeling your hands. And I love that too, because that's quite easy. So far I've given you acquire correct knowledge or truth. Do not gaslight yourself. Acknowledge and honor your feelings. Get present. And by getting present, you can do that to the Seeing Three Things tool, pranayama or breath work using the same breathing or the 3-part breathing. And then also that presence of just feeling your hands. And then you can also practice yoga asana or movement. Yin yoga makes you work, but that work is intuitive and internal. So it gives you something to do and something to look for when you really need to have something to do. You could practice restorative yoga, which will actually invite rest because each pose is received instead of fought for. And so it takes you out of stress response, takes you out of fight, flight, freeze, or fright mode by inviting rest. And some of us are not sleeping right now. So doing restorative yoga for 20 minutes before you go to bed or an hour before you go to bed is a recipe to get you to sleep. Then you could do hatha or forest yoga. I don't recommend doing vinyasa yoga right now. And I know I have a vinyasa teacher on the line, but I don't recommend it right now. I recommend hatha and forest yoga right now because it makes you work and it utilizes the concept of tapas or discipline to help you burn off your thoughts and the karmas of the day and all of that. You can practice Kriya Yoga to purify yourself and the body, but it doesn't get into the competitive nature of Vinyasa Yoga, which might be something that you're personally working on during this time. If you're competitive or ego-driven as your nature, then doing a Vinyasa Yoga can definitely get you tripped up and get you back into that ego mindset of why can't I do this? I'm not doing. Now, if you're enlightening and you're transcending, you can always use that as a practice of self-study and say, oh, this is why I do what I do. This is when I do what I do. But if you are a competitive nature and the yoga that you have been doing is a competitive type of yoga, then doing hatha or forest is cultivating the opposite, which will bear fruits, according to the great yogis. Shars, who is our vinyasa flow teacher on this thread, is saying, if your yoga is competitive, are you doing yoga? No, you're not. But you don't know that you're not doing yoga. And you're just exercising or doing calisthenics. And you may have realized that about yourself. And as the oh my goodness, I'm losing my mind. As I can't remember which group of yogis, but as they would say, these are a group of ancient yogis would say, anything in life can be a poison or a blessing. And so if you are doing a yoga that is creating or delving into your ego self more, then that yoga is your poison, not your blessing. And Shars says, as she did last time, perhaps a combo for another day. So, oh, Will hopped on and he said he has that effect on people. Will, I missed you earlier, man. Plus, we needed some more men on this, and you and Mark arrived late today. So next time we'll have more time. Right now, we're in the recap. So you've got your yin yoga, your restorative yoga, hatha or forest yoga. I don't recommend vinyasa yoga. Other people will. But this gets you out of the funk of sitting. And then most importantly, get into nature. Period.
Get your vitamin D.
Period.
Vitamin D.
Get your vitamin D, and I don't mean that one. I mean the vitamin D that comes into your body through being in the sun. Get into nature. Let the air purify you. You are not quarantined. Probably. Most of us in the U.S. are not quarantined. We are in social distancing. So if you are not quarantined, then there's something really therapeutic about seeing other humans and animals in nature. Get out into nature. The earth is forcing you to pay attention to her. So go outside and listen. Listen. All right. I think we've done a lot here. I think we've done a lot of work. And we went a little past what I had hoped we would do. However, I hope that you have found some knowledge and some ways to move beyond or to be in this experiment that we're having together, and for you to actually enlighten and come out on the other side of it, because this is an experiment of humanity right now. Yeah, an experiment. It's a human experiment. It's an experiment.
Is it experience?
It's that too, but it's an experiment. We're experimenting with what you're gonna do. What you gonna do at the end of this?
When they come for you.
Are you going to enlighten, or are you gonna be the same dumpster fire that you were before this? So
the dumpster fire.
I would like to thank all of you for being here. And being a part of this conversation, whether it be through music or whether it be through your own words or just your own energy. I really appreciate you. This will be replayed, so look for the replay and share it with anyone who wasn't able to come on, or share it with people who need some perspective.
Need to rise up, enlighten.
Yes.
Move beyond the grief state that they're currently in.
Let's transcend this shit. All right. Thank you guys so much for being a part of this conversation. I appreciate you. And for those who came on late, please come on earlier. We'll be on next week, Thursdays at 3 p.m. So come through, be on time. Don't be late for class. All right. It's my goal to leave you better than I found you. I hope that happened for you today. Namaste.
Namaste.